Good morning and welcome. This is 10 Years Hence. Our guest this morning is Lieutenant General Michelle Johnson, who comes to us from Colorado Springs, where she is Superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy. Prior to her selection to be the 19th Superintendent of the Academy, Lieutenant General Johnson was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations and Intelligence, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Casteau, Belgium. A distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1981, General Johnson completed graduate studies as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University before earning her pilot wings in 1984. She has served in various assignments in air mobility, airlift and tanker flying operations and training, academic instruction, and personnel. She has commanded the 9th Air Refueling Squadron, the 97th Operations Group, and the 22nd Air Refueling Wing. The general commanded a deployed air refueling squadron in Operation Southern Watch and an air refueling wing in support of Operations Noble Eagle, Enduring Freedom, and Iraqi Freedom. She has served as an Air Force aide to the President of the United States, an assistant professor of political science, and Associate Air Officer commanding at the U.S. Air Force Academy. She was also the Director of Personnel for Air Force Mobility Command and Director of Air Force Public Affairs. She served as the Deputy Director for Information and Cyberspace Policy on the Joint Staff and as Director of Strategy, Policy, Programs, and Logistics for the U.S. Transportation Command. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome a command pilot with more than 3,600 flying hours in multiple high-performance jet aircraft, a recognized scholar, and a genuine American hero, Lieutenant General Michelle Johnson.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a tremendous honor to be here, and Professor O'Rourke had been one of my instructors in an earlier life, so thank you for having the faith and courage to have me come back and talk with you. Only one disappointment is we came onto the magnificent campus last night, and our journey was a little like some of yours may have been. We got to Chicago, and after we spent 5 or 7 hours there, we said maybe we should just drive over to South Bend. So it was a bit late when we got in, but I was also a basketball player in college, so I was kind of hoping to peek at the Lady Fighting Irish. I think they're in Wake Forest tonight, probably doing really well. But this is a real privilege to be here. What I'd like to do is hopefully be informative enough to be useful to you, because sometimes the cultures that we're in are so different. Our biographies don't resonate, so hopefully I can illuminate that a little bit so you have a better sense of where we are. And then I'm a bit humbled by the title of the talk, that this is about 10 years hence. I hope that we can identify some trends that we're working with and building on that will help us be even in a better place in 10 years from now, and it will provoke some thought on your part, and we can have a great dialogue afterwards. So I really do appreciate you inviting me here. I'm so honored to be part of this 10 Years Hence lecture series. In scanning through the past guest speakers, I noticed that I may be the first actively serving military member speaking as part of this lecture series. And while that might be the case, Notre Dame and the military, and specifically the Air Force and its academy, are not strangers. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised. I know there are some ROTC cadets we were hoping could visit with us today. We have some active duty officers with us today as well. But we've also had other connections. You may not realize this, but there are many similarities between Notre Dame and the Air Force Academy. First, both are consistently ranked high for the quality of our academic programs. I surprise people sometimes by saying I'm actually a college president as well as a commander of a military organization. And that's the hybrid governance when it comes to faculty and the hybrid program that we have for our students out there. So this year, Notre Dame is listed as the number 18 best university by the U.S. News & World Report. And even though inside jokes routinely highlight our academy as a nice little engineering school, we actually come in at number 25 in liberal arts colleges in the country, because our charter as an institution was to have a balanced liberal education as well as science, technology, engineering, and math, because the Air Force is so technology-based. We need to be conversant, and yet we have to lead humans, and the humanities are so valuable. I find myself actually championing humanities a lot because of the balance, I think, that's lost sometimes when we focus so much on STEM, albeit important. So maybe you have thoughts on that as well as we get into our Q&A. But we also rank in the top 5 for undergraduate engineering and management programs, and we're the #1 undergraduate-only research institution. We have 19 research centers. Now, sometimes it's 1 or 2 people. It's not a grand building that you might see. But we do practical work for the Air Force and also work with corporate America, and we're trying to better understand public-private funding so that we can maybe have a new approach to go forward that's easier on the taxpayer and maybe is beneficial for business and for government as we go forward. So I'm really honored to be part of this Mendoza College of Business program, and you're ranked in the top 20 for full-time MBA programs, as you know, and Bloomberg and the Business Week ranked you #1 for job placement. Now, I know in this day and age that job placement really matters, but I was kind of hoping we could be rated for that too, because 100% of our graduates immediately have jobs. So maybe we can work on that next year. The similarities don't end there, though. We both really are proud of the accomplishments of our athletes. Our Air Force Falcons men's outdoor track and field team is a 2-time defending Mountain West Conference champion, which is difficult when you only have 4,000 students. Notre Dame's Fighting Irish football team holds the title for the highest winning percentage amongst college programs and have 13 national championships recognized by the NCAA. So we're proud of you too, because we don't have that. But it makes it a lot easier for me to understand that when your athletic department are out there, like last October when you visited and smashed us, but did it so graciously. Thank you for that. That was great. So now, while college rankings and athletic wins make us and our alumni feel good, I put much more stock into what can't be measured through statistics and surveys, those intangibles that define graduates of both Notre Dame and the Air Force Academy. Both of our institutions stand for something. Our students share a deep sense of duty, a strong intellectual and ethical grounding, and a commitment to making a difference in their communities, their nation, and the world. You'll find Notre Dame and Air Force Academy graduates leading our nation across the spectrum of professions, from business to public service. And Notre Dame's overall focus on ethics makes us natural partners, and we particularly value our relationships with the Mendoza College of Business. As we commit the Air Force Academy to the national dialogue on values and ethical leadership, primarily through our own Center for Character and Leadership Development, we know that partnering with institutions like the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership right here at Mendoza will benefit the discipline and the scholarship as well as the country overall. We actually are building a pretty iconic building at the Academy that is not meant to rival our chapel, which is our iconic symbol, but it will complement it in its architecture, its glass and steel architecture. And we're hoping that that can be a resource for the nation, not just a resource for our academy out in Colorado. And we'll welcome those strengthened connections as we go along, and maybe you'll come visit, but that won't be up for about 1.5 years. But when it's up, you'll have to come out. Now, Mendoza asks its students to ask more of business, emphasizing its foundational mission to promote ethics, values-based leadership, and academic excellence. And this sounds a lot like our mission statement at the Air Force Academy, where we endeavor to produce officers of character to lead our Air Force and our nation. Now, in fact, for me personally, the connection for Notre Dame and Mendoza goes back to 35 years ago, when Dr. O'Rourke was my instructor. You know him as the Arthur F. and Mary J. O'Neill director here at the Fanning Center for Business Communication. But he was a very active and fantastic mentor and teacher and leader at the Air Force Academy. And we were just talking this morning about his coaching of the debate teams, which included our member of Congress that we've had, Heather Wilson. So thank you for all you've contributed, so many generations of leaders. I'm really grateful. So now, as for me, I was at that point making my way through the Academy's second class that was co-ed. The Air Force Academy went co-ed in 1976 after President Ford signed legislation in 1977. And it's a bit surprising sometimes, generationally, for people to realize the arc of change that really has marked my experience. You can hear how eclectic my background is. Sometimes people ask me, what are you in terms of specialty? And I said, well, I'm a general officer with a lowercase g. They ask you to lead organizations, and you may find yourself in that position as well. If you can manage organizations and lead them, sometimes you may not have all the expertise of that specialty, but you're asked to pull things together. And I've been grateful for that opportunity. And in part, it's because of just the timing when things became possible. When I was a cadet, and I entered in 1977 and graduated in 1981. I became the top-ranking cadet, and they had never had a woman do that before. But again, it's a matter of timing. At some point, someone will be first at things. I tended to be there just because it works out that way. It's been a little shocking sometimes, but it's been a great learning experience along the way. And having great mentors was tremendous. I mean, for any of us to have someone give you some sanity checks is invaluable. And now I occupy, as a superintendent of the academy, I'm the first woman to be basically a superintendent at one of the 3 federal academies. The superintendent at Coast Guard Academy is a woman admiral, Sandra Stoss. So this is this historical bow wave that has really marked so much change, and hopefully will become more the norm than the exception as we go along. Now, I don't like to define myself that way. I've come to realize, though, even though I don't want to define myself that way, some of my stories that follow might be informative to you to kind of where we've come from and where we're going, and that gets to the point of the essence of this presentation today, 10 years hence. By the time I entered the Air Force Academy in 1977, racial segregation in the military had been officially over for 35 years. And while gender segregation had also officially been over for decades, there had been a separate but equal program in the military where women weren't on the same promotion track and couldn't have the same jobs as men until the mid-70s. So President Gerald Ford signed legislation in 1975 opening the service academies to women and also different career fields that women could enter. Meanwhile, just of interest, Parliament in England in around 76 had to change legislation so that women could be Rhodes Scholars. Cecil Rhodes probably wouldn't have been wild about that idea, but that's what happened there. So all this change in the 70s, it wasn't just like bad clothes and music and stuff in the 70s. A lot of kind of good stuff happened too. So it was pretty dramatic. I was just talking to Dr. O'Rourke about the attrition rates now. We bring in about 1,200 cadets for each new class and about 900 graduate, so it's about a 15 to 20% attrition rate. It's more fluid for you in your classes than it is for us, but we're producing officers to commission in the Air Force. But back when I came in, they brought in 1,500 people per class, and of those, when I came in, 150 were women. And when we graduated, 63 of us were still in the class. So it was a pretty high attrition rate then. It was shock and awe, I guess, in the early stages as we worked through it. 26 of us went on to pilot training. And keep in mind that none of us were allowed to fly fighter jets. That was prohibited at the time. I personally was happy to fly C-141 cargo jets because I would go out with a crew of 4 to 10 people and fly missions around the world, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, sometimes the Pacific. And this was the Cold War, so it was a routine to it. And we flew everything from bullets to people to patients. It was a very rewarding experience and a great way to learn on small team leadership when you're in the middle of Africa with a high-frequency radio, and that's it. And I know what's really startling to you is that this is way before cell phones and GPS and everything else. We used actual maps and things. It was pretty cool stuff. We felt like explorers. Now, one thing I was not allowed to do was to fly airdrop, where you'd throw cargo or paratroopers out the back with a parachute to resupply troops on the ground, because that was considered combat. And that wasn't opened up until 91. And so sometimes when I talk to military members, they go, really? Why couldn't you do that? And I said, well, realize the historic sweep that we've been through and the changes demographically, socially, in so many ways, and economically in our world. And sometimes when graduates from the 60s critique us, I think it would be like when MacArthur was the superintendent of West Point in 1920, and he would have Civil War veterans criticizing him. There's 50 years of history have come and gone, and we need to adapt to that. I'm sure the alumni here at Notre Dame are very progressive, and they never harken back to 50 years ago. So at any rate. So anyway, that might seem crazy now, but it was only 23 years ago, and the topic of women in combat still finds a place in the political stage. And just last year, the Department of Defense instructed the services to open all combat positions to women, by merit, of course, if you can meet the qualifications for that field. Now, our definition of diversity changed again more recently. In September of 2011, the Department of Defense took an unprecedented step towards integration with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. the 1994 policy barring openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual persons for the military service, and passed by Congress in December 2010. It was in 2010 that Congress passed that. Each of the armed services had several months to prepare for the changes that were about to take place and to reinforce among their personnel the respect and professionalism that were expected, regardless of personal preferences. Prior to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, many observers predicted that allowing lesbian, gay, and bisexual or LGBT troops to serve openly would harm the military. But a year later, an independent study found that the repeal had no overall negative impact. In fact, I think most servicemen and women would tell you the repeal came and went uneventfully. Thus, the military basically declared victory on integrating LGBT troops in our ranks. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Just as with other minority groups, official integration of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals into the military did not seamlessly transform into what we like to think of as inclusion, from integration to inclusion. Like all Department of Defense employees, staff, faculty, and cadets at the Air Force Academy took part in respect training on this front in 2011. However, every year since then, we've welcomed another 1,200 new students in, each bringing different experiences, backgrounds, and personal viewpoints, a diversity that we were seeking out. However, with that rich variety of thought and experience comes some biases and prejudices. So this last fall, we had a lot of headlines because what we do plays out on the national stage, and it does for Notre Dame in many ways, but for us at a Federal Service Academy in Colorado, we have a lot of national issues play out. And in the course of answering some questions, I had a great opportunity to meet with our LGBT cadets, and they work together in an affinity group called Spectrum and get together about once a month and just sort of a support group. They exchange ideas, and we have several affinity groups like that at the Academy, as I'm sure you have here. And I had a chance to talk to our cadets, and they said, about 180 of them are out and feel very comfortable and safe and supported being out. They love the Air Force. They love to serve. They want others to be able to come. But they said the mistake that the system made was assuming that it was the old people who would be upset by their gayness, when actually the old people are doing okay. We are making them feel safe. It's the new wave of every wave of people that come in with their ideas from across the country that maybe aren't that open and maybe don't see that this is an important part of diversity. And so in talking with our alumni, our gay alumni, and LGBT alumni, and then our cadets, I felt heartened that they feel safe. But we know that there are many still who aren't comfortable coming out. And sometimes we can't control their factors. In fact, we had a cadet that we're really worried about before Christmas. He holed himself up in his room, and fortunately, because of social media, peers and others can stay in contact with people who are in distress. And when he came out, he apologized to our dean of students is called the commandant, and he's a brigadier general, right? So, but that's who he is. But he went to him and said, I'm really sorry to be disruptive, but I just found out I can't go home because my parents won't accept me. But right away we said, but you feel safe, you have 1,000 homes that we'd invite you home. And he said, absolutely. So we do all we can, but we can't control every factor. But it's something for us to be tuned into. We need to understand that. And I was so grateful for our colleagues of all persuasions to help me understand how we can have a lens of understanding as we work with diversity. So as we look 10 years hence, we hope we can have moved toward inclusion of the factors we can control and maybe have some influence over the other factors in people's lives who are going to help lead our nation in so many different roles. So while openly lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members have been successfully integrated into the military, I don't think we can declare victory on inclusion just yet. So debates over the merits of allowing open and gay people to serve, or women in combat, or religious respect in the military, name just a few of the military's integration efforts and speak to the changes occurring across society over time. Military leaders face significant challenges as to how to best deal with the internal effects of these contentious issues as they play out in society, and we're a reflection of society. We dress like this, but we're Americans, and we bring all those views and expectations into our service. Legislative and executive directives, often influenced by societal pressures, are the driving force behind many of the military's integration efforts. Of course, absolutely fundamental to the American founding are the principles of majority rule and minority rights. So these principles are founded in the Constitution to which we give our oath of service. Moreover, just as in business, the military recognizes that to be successful and recruit and retain the best employees, we must value the diversity that all of our airmen, soldiers, sailors, and Marines offer. Former Secretary of the Air Force Michael Donnelly said it best, "Across the service, we represent a broad range of diverse missions, family situations, ethnicities, faiths, races, and educational backgrounds. Yet together, this rich tapestry forms the world's finest Air Force, drawn from the best talent that America has to offer." Thus, the military has become an essential example for organizational integration and a bastion for tolerance. So why has the military been able to integrate different racial, ethnic, religious, and national groups so effectively overall? With, shortcomings. I'm not saying we're perfect, but overall we've done really well. Military scholars suggest several reasons. First, intergroup contact itself has eased intergroup conflict. I grew up in Iowa, in the northwest corner of Iowa, with the weather just about like this all the time in the winter. And so I didn't have the exposure to the diversity of people when I was younger. And I'm grateful for the experiences I've had since I went out to Colorado in 1977. And that's maybe the case for a lot of people. They haven't had the contact. Second, the obedience and formality inherent in the military helps to mitigate tensions arising from personal feelings and promotes professionalism in the workplace. We can demand standards or say you can't be on our team. Third, the military employs powerful sanctions not available in most parts of civilian society to implement integration policies and ensure their compliance across the ranks. But policy change alone will not get us to where we need to be tomorrow or in 10 years, however. Integration is not enough, and it should not be our goal. We must continue to pursue inclusion. While much of the training the military uses during times of integration is focused on tolerance, we need to go beyond that. Tolerating, if we define it as putting up with or enduring, isn't enough to achieve inclusion. So what does inclusion look like, particularly in an organization like the Air Force? Well, institutionally, it entails creating opportunities where everyone, regardless of their differences, can be their best. It means removing unnecessary or artificial qualification and experience barriers to allow people from a variety of backgrounds to fully engage at all levels of the organization, both up and down and side to side. It would create an environment that welcomes professional diversity, whereby experiences outside a traditional career path or field of expertise are encouraged and valued. It is an understanding that everyone brings a portfolio of perspectives, ideas, experiences, and capabilities that go far beyond gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, or the specialty badge we wear on our chest. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. At an individual level, it necessitates moving beyond tolerating others to valuing each other for what they contribute to the team. For us in the Air Force, it's about accomplishing the mission to fly, fight, and win in air, space, and cyberspace. It's about global vigilance, global reach, and global power for America. To do all of that in an era of diminishing resources, we simply cannot ignore the countless benefits of a diverse force. Statistically speaking, the military as a whole is fairly representative of the United States demographically, particularly in the enlisted ranks. And I think back in particular on a mission I flew in the 1980s. I know that was the Cold War, it was a long time ago. But I was the aircraft commander, I was the pilot, and we were flying to Europe. And my co-pilot was African American, my flight engineer was Puerto Rican, and we had 2 flight nurses on board, one a white man and one a black man, because that's America. And when we landed at the bases where we arrived, where our allies were hosted, they marveled at us and said, "That's very American." And I said, "Yeah, it's very American. This is who we are. We're everybody." And so there have been some things that have been pretty good for a long time, and yet some things we still need to work on. And so even as the military services move toward inclusion, like the rest of society, we find in-groups and out-groups in the armed forces. Sometimes groupings are determined by factors intrinsic to who we are, race, gender, age. But in many cases, they are arrived at in a somewhat arbitrary fashion. It's simple, even capricious, as us versus them. In 1944, C.S. Lewis spoke of these unwritten hierarchies to the young men of King's College in London and warned of dangers inherent in this type of classification and how destructive in-group, out-group dynamics can be. In 2011, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, also commented on the harmful effects of in-groups and out-groups. He noted that we have separate classes of military personnel, with one part of the population designated as warriors and another part that's designated as something else. That disparity, he said, begins to establish a psychology that leads to behavior contrary to the overall goals and values of the institution. I'll give you an example. In the Air Force, the separate classes of military personnel play itself out in something we informally called tribes, right? So tribes can be various career fields or even within career fields to particular specialties. We see tribal infighting of what kind of airplane you fly. So I started out flying cargo jets, 4-engine C-141s. They're retired now, which dates me again. But that's what I did. But that wasn't considered, cutting edge. It was older, and we did really great missions, but it wasn't considered quite the same as maybe even amongst heavy jets. And to the plane I went to next was called a KC-10 Extender. It's a DC-10 jumbo jet that does cargo and air refueling, which is really a powerful instrument for our Air Force, and a lot newer than C-141s. C-141s, as airplanes go, have vertical stabilizers on the top of their tail, like that. So they're called T-tails. KC-10s had the vertical stabilizer at the bottom, so they didn't have T-tails. So the T-tailers who came into the tanker squadron were lesser. And it became amazing just to see. It was like the experiment they have with little kids with the blue eyes and the brown eyes and who's better. It was T-tails and this new technology, and we couldn't possibly adapt to the new plane and it became so petty and so destructive that while we were waiting for a new building to be built, we were working out of double-wide trailers, and we needed to do some wiring. Okay, this is the 90s now, so we had to actually wire things together, plug them in. It's a little different, no Wi-Fi back then. So the T-tailers had, for the sake of the unit, aligned a new scheduling software and plugged it in, and then at night, the KC-10 guys, who were called Gucci guys because they thought they were, would pull them out. And it sounds like sabotage, and they were embarrassed about that later, but it was sort of playing out this in-group, out-group thing, and we were able to resolve it in our small group. But writ large, it becomes more dangerous to say, what I do is more valuable than what you do. And actually, as I've come through the ranks, and now I've been commissioned for 33 years, and I've had these very high staff jobs, I have found more challenge in professional diversity almost than in the human demographics because of how we judge. You haven't done what I've done, so it can't possibly be as valuable as what I've done. And it's something we work against. So I lob that out there for your consideration, maybe for discussion. But I found that fascinating. People are sometimes more hung up on the badge I wear than my gender or the fact that I'm from Iowa and constantly tell jokes about it. But anyway, so fascinating stuff to me anyway. Now, our current Air Force leadership, Secretary of the Air Force Deborah Lee James, and Chief of Staff General Mark Welsh are also concerned about the detrimental effects of the separate classes of personnel within our service. They're currently focusing on the Air Force's nuclear mission, about which you've probably read, a mission that is arguably the most important of all. Our airmen are entrusted with the most powerful weapons on Earth. Yet within the Air Force, airmen in the missile career field may not feel as valued or that their mission is as noble as it is. At the Air Force Academy, we're checking our own processes to see if we're reinforcing this perception in our career field assignments. Who are we assigning, and how are we preparing them? Are we telling them, that's great, congratulations? Are we saying, oh, bummer, you're going to go to missiles? This is important stuff, how we act inside organizations. The mishaps and the negative headlines surrounding the nuclear community over the recent months and years highlight the need to avoid the truly harmful consequences of in-group and out-groups and the mentality that can undermine the effectiveness of the Air Force. Affecting the root cause of some of these challenges is just one aspect of the advantage of a 4-year resident academy experience where cadets have constant exposure to the ethos of airmen and our professional culture. It illustrates one way in which our Air Force takes immensely diverse and heterogeneous people from our population and builds a community loyal to a common set of core values: integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. We don't take that lightly, and when we get it wrong, it has huge ramifications. So that's why it's such a vital thing I wanted to raise with you today. Deliberate education and training helps change the way individuals view themselves and their role in society. Thus, we have an opportunity at the Air Force Academy to affect the entire force by inculcating an inclusive mindset where diversity is valued for its intrinsic benefits, not because we have to. Also aiding in the transformation is the very nature of a military professional career. Not entirely different than in many civilian professions, performance is a key determining factor at each step along the way. Promotion, as the assessment of potential for greater responsibility, is conducted blind of gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation. Merit is measured about as objectively as humanly possible. After all, arbitrary discriminators are meaningless to an aircraft or a satellite. They don't care what you look like. They just want to make sure you make the right inputs. So then what is needed in the next decade to push through to inclusion? In my opinion, it comes down to leadership. The Department of Defense is facing challenging times. In many ways, we have been redefined by over a decade of conflict. And as we enter an interwar period, we're finding ourselves at a historic inflection point. Rapidly declining budgets, advancements in technology, and a force transitioning from the fast pace of combat to the tempo of garrison life requires leadership prepared for the challenges inherent in interwar periods. Across the services, senior leaders are recognizing the characteristics of this inflection point and are attempting to address it both tactically and strategically. At a strategic level, the changing nature of the profession of arms has caught attention. As a result of the changes in how we fight wars and changes across society in general, all services are analyzing how a modern military force should look today and into the future, whether more should be in the reserves and the National Guard and less in the active duty, how we train, where we should be posted, what's the human equation here to balance with technology. Of course, the Air Force still flies airplanes and drops bombs, as we have since World War I, albeit much more accurately, with far greater precision and sophistication in delivery. But in the new way of war, much of what we do today is sort of invisible. If I may, a few weeks ago, there was some activity in New Jersey having to do with a bridge. And the talking heads on the Sunday morning talk shows said, maybe the people in the rest of the country aren't that interested in New Jersey having a traffic jam. But they understand what it means to block a bridge. They understand what that means. It's humanly understandable. Sometimes for our Air Force and what we do, it's not so understandable because it's a little bit invisible. We don't have silk scarves and biplanes anymore where you can keep track of who's the ace and who's not. We have a linkage. For instance, so there was a Jordanian terrorist in Iraq a few years ago named Zarqawi, and the special forces had tracked him for a couple of years and finally found out where he was. And they realized it would be harder to go into the place that he was held up and without losing a bunch of soldiers than it would be to have the airstrikes. So they made a phone call to, this is from Iraq, to a base in Qatar that communicated with a base in Nevada and a satellite and a pod on a drone and an F-16. And in about a couple of minutes, 2 F-16s showed up and dropped a 500-pound bomb on the house. And that's war, and maybe some of you have an issue with that, but that's what we do, and that's modern warfare. But nobody saw those electrons flying around at the speed of light to understand what's the Air Force role in that. And even though you're very bright and you get it and it's easy for you, not everybody really gets that. Why do we need an Air Force? Well, it's like the network. It's like saying my iPhone stands alone, and you know that all these devices don't stand alone. They're linked, and you can't function unless they're linked through some kind of network, cyber, through space, and then to hardware, whether it's for business or for military. But look how long it took me to explain that. So that's one of our challenges, is to say, what do you do? Well, it's not just flying planes. It's a whole airspace and cyberspace, and it makes it hard for people to really understand. So Now, in the spirit of joint service, I'll reach out to our parent service, the U.S. Army. And according to the Army's Field Manual 1, the first two of capstone manuals that guide every soldier, and the Army is particularly guided by this because they're much more labor intensive inherently because it's the Army. But no matter how much technology advances, it is still humans who accomplish the mission. The profession of arms is less about the tools used to conduct warfare as it is about the men and women committed to selfless service to the nation. Only with quality service members answering the noble call to serve freedom, can we ensure victories on the battlefields of today and the future. It always comes back to the people. After all, we are just humans and we're all different. At the Air Force Academy, our mission is to educate, train, and inspire men and women to become officers of character, motivated to lead the United States Air Force in service to our nation. Our business is to produce young people prepared to deal with the changing nature of the profession of arms, who have the character necessary to put themselves above the tribal infighting, and who have experienced the intrinsic value of diversity and look beyond the differences to appreciate mutual respect. Our formula for accomplishing this isn't perfect. We have hit road bumps along the way, and we have much to accomplish. However, I truly believe we're on the right track. We emphasize character and leadership as the cornerstone for all of what we do. It finds a home in our academic curriculum, our military training, and our athletic and airmanship programs. We are especially focused on fostering a culture of commitment and a climate of respect. Across the military, the military academic and athletic areas of our academy, we're emphasizing leadership opportunities for the cadets and are stressing a stronger sense of duty and accountability. I may have alluded to this initially. Sometimes at academies you can be overly parochial and overly parental and not let young people of your age make their choices and make some of those mistakes. So when they walk out, they have the maturity that goes with the training that they've had. And we're taking more of a chance on them now. This millennial generation is really stepping up. And I think some of our alumni, when they find out we're doing it, will be alarmed. But I think it's going to pay off really well. The Air Force Academy rests firmly upon the notion of service. Service to a country and a profession which one day may cost blood and treasure. Alongside the commitment each cadet makes to the Constitution of the United States is their commitment to the Air Force. Our Air Force's core values are, again, integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. They are the guiding principles that bind all airmen together, and to us, they are absolutely non-negotiable. And that's why it's tragic when they are violated, when there's a breach, and it becomes national news. We believe we have the opportunity right now to make changes, not just at the Air Force Academy, but across the Air Force, the Department of Defense, and perhaps the country. We are tackling problems like sexual assault and leading the way with our programs of religious respect. If we can make strides to eliminate the vestiges of discrimination, attack the tribal conflict head-on, and capitalize on the diversity that every single person brings to the mission before our graduates enter the Air Force, then we are that much closer to the inclusive environment that we envision. Getting there won't be easy, however. It will require strong leadership and courage, particularly moral courage. When I went to work at the White House, and what I did when you're the military aide to the president, you carry the football, which has nuclear codes and the 25th Amendment and the succession of the presidency. That's what you do. And so it's a pretty grave duty. And also you marshal motorcades and make sure they have the right golf clubs. So there's, it's a good balance in there. It's not all grim, although I'm a terrible golfer, but that's beside the point. But when I went there was a retired Army lieutenant general, which seemed really senior to me back then. And he'd fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And he said, you know what? I want you to think about this. He said, dodging bullets and in combat takes less moral courage than telling somebody, looking them in the eye and saying, that's not going right. That won't cut it in the cold light of day. That's not the right thing to do. To tell a peer, we don't do that. That's not how we are. We're better than that. And I believed him because he did dodge bullets. And in the moment, adrenaline and training handles that first bit when something's on fire and something's exploding and you have to keep your head about yourself. This is not, a lot of work on your prefrontal cortex, I don't think. This is that primal stuff. But that prefrontal cortex has to come in when the cold light of day. Maybe if you're in a missile silo and it's not very glamorous and nobody's watching. Are you going to do the right thing? And that's the fabric of who we are. And that's even more challenging, I think. So we may not be as good at honoring the courage of an honorable bystander, the young person who stands up in a crowd to say that a joke is inappropriate. It takes a lot of courage to stand up to one's peers or even superiors that stop behaviors that would be conducive to an inclusive environment. As Edmund Burke said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men, good people, to do nothing. And that makes it a great challenge because sometimes good men and women don't recognize patterns as soon as they should or have the moral courage to stop them before they metastasize. Cultural improvements are never easy and they do not occur immediately. It may take decades for us to see the benefits of our efforts. Thus, we must start now so that 10 years hence we can be closer to where we need to be. I want to wrap this up so that we have plenty of time for questions, but I first want to leave you with these parting thoughts. As graduates of Notre Dame, people will expect something special of you, just as they do from the Air Force Academy graduates. They will assume that you embody the qualities of this institution, that your character reflects your alma mater. So habituate yourself today for who you want to be 10 years hence. Qualities like moral courage take practice. It's a habit of thought. As you enter the world of business, nonprofit, or perhaps public service, preserve your character, your values, and background. As businessman Jim Rohn said, character isn't something you were born with and can't change, like your fingerprints. It's something you weren't born with and must take responsibility in forming. So moving from integration to inclusion won't just happen on its own pace. It will require effort and dedication, a devotion to making the culture and the environment a better place. So I look forward to collaborating further with the leaders at Notre Dame and Mendoza over time so that we can learn from each other and take ourselves farther down the road in this journey. Again, I'm really honored that you'd include me here today, and I hope I've provoked some thought and some tough questions, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much. Do you want to be the mediator, Dr. O'Rourke, or just pick? Who gets to pick? I'm not sure if
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for coming to speak with us. You mentioned the phrase tribal thinking, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that. You kind of argue for more diversity because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But were you also arguing that diversity can help the Air Force, do a better job?
Right.
Is there like an example where tribal
Right.
thinking led to something bad? You wish there was more diversity to avoid that?
Okay. No, thanks a lot. And I hope I don't use too much arcane jargon. That's one of the challenges for us always. It's, peer bonding is stronger a lot of times than people aspiring to a higher cause, if you will. There's a lot of scholarship on this, I know. But just practically speaking, you'll hear people say in the military, I fight for the people in the foxhole with me. And of course, these are American, servicemen and women. But it's the people next to you that your loyalties tend to form with, right? Your team or your specialty. Like I said, I'm a pilot, or was. I play a desk now, right? I'm in management. But I have wings, and so that puts me in a certain tribe. And you've got wings, and you're in that tribe. You have a different tribe. Could you stand up and show them your badge? So what tribe are you in?
The acquisitions tribe.
So he's in the acquisitions tribe, okay, which is immensely important. I mean, they have huge amounts of money. But people associate a lot of times wings as being, well, you're a pilot, therefore you're really valuable. But the acquisition guy has a different badge. Now, he knows other acquisition guys, and they work together all the time, and they train together all the time, but maybe don't interface with this other tribe. And so in our organizations, it hurts us to not have a sense of what each other do. We need each other. We can't do this without him. We can't have this big Air Force with the technology without their knowledge. But if we get busy saying, well, what my part's much more important than anybody else's part, we sub-optimize each other. I would just even say, and there are natural tensions in big institutions, right? So there's a natural tension at the academy. We have faculty who teach in the classroom, and we have staff who are out with cadets doing military training, and then we have coaches in the athletic department. they're all part of the experience. They're all part of the mission. But if we don't talk to each other, we trip over each other. Sometimes it's just as practical as scheduling over each other, so you don't get to listen to a same lecture series or understand the theme that we're taking on in particular courses. And sometimes it's behavioral. I think sometimes the tensions of NCAA Division I sports pull students into a different place, and then they're considered a little different. And it's not helpful in an organization like ours for people to feel like they're separate from the larger organization. They should feel nested in. So what we're trying to work at is to appreciate the value of each other's role. There have been, I mean, this is not a new idea. I think for a long time we've been trying to get to that, but we really see it jump out. And I don't know if social media and cable TV add to it, but you know how these days people will go and they'll seek ideas that reinforce their own instead of being comfortable to talk with others. But for us, it becomes sort of like when I show up someplace, the Air Force made me the head of Air Force Public Affairs, which is entertaining because I didn't have any background in that at all. They wanted me to help tie that function into the rest of the Air Force. But it was hard for the public affairs specialists to accept me because I hadn't done that. That wasn't my specialty. I needed to lead them and pull them over. And I think really strong CEOs and other managers do those kinds of things. You can't be the expert in each thing, but the experts may not appreciate a stranger coming in, and the stranger may be marked in our business. We have all this stuff on our jackets, you know, that label us. You don't have that, but you have a corner office, or you have a certain salary, a certain parking spot, or a certain, you know, primary mission in the arena. And if you're not allowed to do that primary mission, maybe you're not as valued. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's just, I think it's human nature, and the scholars out here will be able to tell me what the words are for that.
I'd like a follow-on to that one. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, but I always wondered, I was in the corporate world, why do you continue to wear wings and ribbons? And, you know, someone come in and said that he has more ribbons than you. Why do you do that? Why do we continue to do that? Is there a reason? Is it because of the command that you have over the troops?
For the ribbons, I think that this is, I don't know that it's exact policy. We don't get compensated tremendously financially. People with similar responsibilities to me are paid 5, 10, 100 times as much as I get paid. That's not why we serve. But we can't pay people more. And you can imagine people junior to me don't get paid much. So one of the things is we can't give you a lot of monetary compensation. But, you know, I think maybe on the active duty we talked about it then too, is we can thank you. We can show appreciation. A lot of the stuff on here marks what you did. It's not valorous. There are a few special things for the people who've been in combat. You can tell from the marks on there, to honor them for doing something special. A lot of this is a track of responsibilities I've had and things I've done. So depending on where you go, as you said, some people have ribbons crawling over their shoulders like, you know, the Soviet Union back in the day. We hope we're not quite like that. But it's really because we can't give a lot of tangible reward. A lot of what we do is intangible. For those of you who are pursuing a lot of the things you're doing, you feel that way as well. You're in it for service. You're not in there to be millionaires. You're trying to do something right. So that's the ribbons part. It's partly it's to say what you do, actually the good part of it is, don't you think, and you can reflect on your experience as well, when you walk in a room to say, who have I got here in the team that makes sure we have all the expertise we need to make it work that way?
I agree.
Yeah. It does, yeah. Well, and it's a challenge. And here's the thing, as time goes by, you know, you'll have people say, well, are pilots the only warriors in the Air Force? No, they were. And that's what's upside down about the Air Force. In the Army, they're a lot more enlisted than officers, and the officers are out there on the ground with them. In the Air Force, the way we grew up, the sergeants worked on the planes and sent the officers off to war, right? So it sort of put it on its head. Now we've got a different approach, and it's not just about officers enlisted, but it's about who's on the front line. In a lot of cases, it's our civil engineers who found the IEDs to save people's lives, or our security forces who are on the ground and they're right next to the soldiers. So the way we fight war now is much more joint since 1986 with Goldwater-Nichols Act. It's a joint team. And that's the power of the United States Department of Defense, is that we have all these pieces that fit together. But as you say, some of our hierarchies may not have caught up with that. So I don't have all the answers to it, but I think we're more open about talking about it. So, and thank you for your service, sir. Anything else?
Thanks. I know you talked a lot about, like, you were the first woman to be the superintendent and, like, the second co-ed class in the Air Force Academy. Do you still face challenges being a woman in leadership, or do you think we've come far enough that we're equal? Like, any personal experience you have with that?
It's been long. We're very hierarchical in the Air Force, so it takes about 33 years to make a lieutenant general. And there aren't a lot of people around the table, people of color or women. And what we're wrestling with right now is the pipeline issue. When we assess people, the numbers are about the same. So what's going on in the pipeline? Same thing that I think corporate world is trying to balance out. If you're trying to make your bones in your 20s and 30s, that's also when you're trying to start a family and sort out what you want out of life. And for moms and dads as we go through. In terms of facing people, I'm still a bit of a novelty when I show up some places, and especially, and this is what's really been educational for me, for the alumni. My executive officer is African American, and one day I was asking him, I said, do you think that my predecessor faced those kinds of questions from the alumni from the 60s? And he said, of course not. You're just standing there. You're representing the change. But I'm also... the numbers are still small. So we're wondering about that pipeline issue. In terms of personal respect, I think you can earn that. When I went to NATO almost 3 years ago, I felt like I'd gone back about 20, 25 years because they don't have women admirals and generals pretty much, even amongst our allies. But what happened was I just was myself and did my best, and I became, that's just another American general because they're just like that. That's an American thing. So because of the flag I wear and I represent, that helps me internationally because they understand how we work. Internally, it's still a bit of a novelty, and it takes a while for people to shake that off of who's in charge and how we balance out. And we look at people hear each other, they perceive each other differently for all those things. I've been very fortunate to be here. Every day isn't so easy, but I also truly believe that you hang in there and your merit shows, at least in our system, it's recognized and supported regardless of how you look. But still, we're human. We're still human. And at the Academy, I'm the senior person, so it's kind of hard for people to give me a hard time. Any place else they can. So, thank you.
Thanks, yeah. Thank you, Lieutenant General Johnson, not only for your speech, but for your service and your commitment to achieve what you've done. It requires a lot of focus and diligence, so thank you, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's grateful. I'm wondering, you mentioned how there seems to be a disparity in the representation demographically and how we need to go to the pipeline. I guess at the beginning of the pipeline, what is the perhaps a proportionate share of people applying? Does that affect it too, in different interests based on, different differences in people?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. One of the most amazing things to learn is how students are assessed into service academies. It's not just one long order of merit that you draw on a line. It's like the Electoral College. And really, literally, because it's by congressional district. And to go to an academy, you have to have a nomination from a senator or a congressman or the vice president, or if your parents were Medal of Honor winners. There are all these categories, but in the main, we can't have recruiting goals. We can't say, we don't have as many people of Hispanic background sitting around the table as generals as we ought to have, which is true. We can't go target per se because that's not allowed, because that would be a biased approach. But we don't have enough people of color to represent who America really is, or even, for women as well. The way we recruit is by congressional district and underrepresented congressional districts. And by that effort, our admissions office tries to get our incoming classes to look as much like the demographic breakdown of America as we can. But is that adequate so that 30 years later, the people at the top of the pyramid, and this is what's interesting about tribes, right? Different tribes have different pyramids. A lot of command opportunities flying, not as many command opportunities for an acquisition person. So now your pyramids take a different shape, and there's fewer opportunities to do the things that would take you to the top, do we need to start out with more people at the bottom of when we're not the bottom, I don't want to put it that way, at the beginning, so that you have more people at the end? Maybe by matching the demographics exactly when you come in isn't the right way. Maybe you need more. But there are some communities in the United States that aren't as familiar with military service. They remember the Vietnam. They think bad things about this. They believe the movies where all the generals are really dumb. They're not really. But people don't understand this. And fewer people, like 0.5% of Americans serve in uniform. And, out of 300 million people, that still leaves a pretty big military service. But that's why we're looking at the pipeline and try to look at it differently and see if there are on-ramps and off-ramps, maybe between Guard and Reserve and active duty, so people can start families or take care of ill parents. I mean, things happen. You get in your 40s, and parents start to have real life happen to them, or yourselves, and things break. And so there are health issues that could take you off the track if it remains this sort of up or out machine that just grinds. And so those are the kinds of things that we're trying to look at for the good of the force, too, because you don't want to drive out good people because they're having trouble when life knocks at the door, which it does for everybody. And I'm very fortunate. My husband was a cargo pilot and retired at 20 years because that's when I had the twins. And so we have twin boys who are 11. And the way we run our house is that my husband runs the house. And he's an electrical engineer, VMI grad, so he runs the house like that. So it's pretty entertaining. But that's how but everybody's got a different way. But that was like late in the game, but that's not where everybody works it out. So those kinds of policies really matter about how people can balance it. And also just longevity. People live longer. And some of our policies were made back when people didn't live as long. And so are we making complete use of people into the prime years of their lives rather than making them retire for different reasons? And so all those things can play because, for some people, if they could step out a little bit and then come back in, maybe we could benefit from their talents over time rather than driving them out. So at least those things are being considered right now. And sometimes fiscal crunches make you look at things like that to say what's really important, and use the crisis to focus on what's really valuable, and maybe something better comes of it. So did I get it?
Yeah, that covers a lot.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Well, again, ma'am, thanks for being here. Appreciate it so much. You talked about gender equality earlier and throughout the lecture this morning. Our society, culturally, we sort of have this different view of women and children. In some respects, chivalry may play some aspect of that. What are your thoughts, I guess, on balancing that component of life as people develop, or that societal, cultural impact, with them being equal at the tip of the spear, and just balancing that mindset that for so many may have been ingrained for 18, 20 plus years?
Hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So I'll quote former Congresswoman Heather Wilson, who was a debater at the Academy for Dr. O'Rourke and a member of Congress. And when a lot of the discussions started up about this, she talked and she framed it this way, along the lines of saying, those who are able to protect others ought to protect those who cannot. And so in that sense of if you're able to step up and serve in a certain role and serve your nation, there's your obligation. And the respect for each other goes there. And so there are a lot of arguments about chivalry isn't like the most lively thing that I've noticed for a long time, but people respecting each other is. But how you respect someone, if you respect them by putting them to one side or respect them by having them at your side. And I think that's what's tricky. And I don't pretend that human nature changes in the course of my professional career. It's been a really interesting thing. I spoke at Columbia University a couple of years ago, and I did some homework about it and realized that Notre Dame became co-ed, I think, in the early 70s, but the Ivies, a lot of them didn't go co-ed till the 80s. And so this last century and this one are really a different time in human history about how we can grapple with this. I mean, people have been having some of this conversation before, but I don't pretend that turns on a dime. But I think the possibilities are really ripe now in our modern society. And having been out in Afghanistan a lot and in Africa a lot, and I realized we're very fortunate to be Americans because of the way we work our lives. We're technology-based. We value a certain kind of education, and we have the luxury of doing that. If you're trying to survive, it puts you in a different place. And you watch a culture like the Afghan culture and how they wrestle with that. You don't make them into Western Europe, in a decade. But where we are as Americans is a special place. And so we have to sort that out. But I think it's just respect for what people bring, and not to put them in a box or to put them in a class. And I think that's what the danger is, if I may. If you take people and say, well, you're in a certain class, therefore that class of people can't. How about taking us one at a time and then see what's possible? And I think that'll help us a lot. But it's hard. We're human. We are tribal, right? We're wired that way. But if we put people in a box, if you say women can't, you go, well, which women can't? And being protective of men who maybe can't be. Look at even with what we do with people who are wounded warriors now. We celebrate them and we celebrate their courage. And we know when they come to work, they may have a hitch in their stride or they may have something else, but we help and protect them, men and women, right? So do we not help and protect the wounded men because they're weak now? So there's a lot of real primal stuff that goes on in that, but I think if we're respectful and open, we can work through it. That seems okay. Okay.
General Johnson, thanks for being here. Thanks for the talk. Let me ask a defense-related question, if I may. As I look back on the last 10 years, I see virtually unrestrained budgets in the Department of Defense. The acquisition folks just had to make a phone call, and there was a skid load of whatever they wanted at their doorstep. We're obviously entering a new period in American history. What are severely restrained budgets, and if I may use a technical term, restraints on end strength, the number of folks in uniform? What are those going to do to our ability to defend the nation, to do what we think we need to do, and how's that going to play out?
Well, it's driving us to figure out what's important. For us at the Academy, we look through to say, what's the essence of what we do? We can't necessarily keep everything we have, but how far do we go before we lose our ability to succeed in the mission they've asked us to do in character and leadership development and competition, the liberal education with the STEM balance, and the sense of immersion in the culture and the ethos that 4-year experience gives. Just brick and mortar colleges are going through some of these things as well, as we've talked about before. So for us, it means a few hundred people probably we cut, and maybe some sports, which is tremendously emotional, or maybe some courses and classes. For the military writ large, it really does require us to look at this. Here are the unintended consequences of some things. By enlarging the ground forces, the Marines and the Army, to help deal with the ground-based, boots-on-the-ground conflicts we've had in Southwest Asia for the last decade, you have a lot more soldiers and Marines. Where are you going to garrison them at the bases back here? So those balancing acts of how many forces do they need in those really labor-intensive services, which bases? For the Air Force, what would help us is that, and no company would do this, we have infrastructure spread across a lot of states, but we live in a democratic republic where we have congressional districts and 54 states and territories who want their base and the jobs that come with it. So it's very hard for us to do BRAC. We'd like to divest ourselves of some bases, but the civilians control the military, so they make the choice on that. So it hamstrings us a little bit, but the Air Force is going to cut from about 330,000 people in the active duty Air Force. We'll cut 25,000 in about 2 weeks from now, starting in March to the end of September, 25,000 and about 550 aircraft, which is a big deal. But then the governors don't always like that because they like to have iron on their ramps. So what are the implications are? We're going to have a balancing act of what capability the taxpayers and the members of Congress will support And you'd like it to be purely strategy-based, but sometimes it's what you're allowed to do. And so from the Air Force perspective, we have to identify those things that are really important. Do we still have a air-to-air capability? But I will say there's been no American injured or killed by hostile air power since 1953, when a general aviation airplane came across the border from North Korea and went into South Korea. We've had air superiority for a long time, and people have gotten used to that. The trouble is it's expensive if someone else has an actual air force. Not so much Al-Qaeda with an air force. So we fought in a different way, and we supported in a different way, as I described, and we integrated jointly. But we have to figure out who we are. The Navy and the Air Force have tried to come up with a air-sea strategy because the Pacific is a big place, and there's a lot of tension in the Pacific Rim. How do we work together strategically to take advantage of each other's skills? The Army has a different kind of footprint in the Pacific, obviously, because of distances and and it's hard to say that anybody's really the enemy, but to be ready to go out. But that costs a lot to maintain the technology for air superiority, and yet shouldn't we have some? And those are the balancing acts we're trying to come up with now. The Navy, how many ships? If they have less than 12 carriers, it's hard to have a presence around the globe. But see, this is what comes from being an empire, really, is our global presence. To have these combatant commands across the globe is unique amongst nations. And so there's probably discussion about that. Can we maintain that architecture? Do you want to maintain that architecture as taxpayers? So it would be great for people to be engaged in those conversations. So it could have it has a sobering impact, that's for sure, to see what we get. By the same token, members of Congress don't want us to go beyond the point where we can't be the force you want us to be. We just won't be the same force we were in the midst of the largesse over the last few. It may not be exactly what you wanted, but we got thousands of MRAPs, and we shipped them over to Afghanistan, but now most of them we can't get back because we don't need them. It was for that conflict. So we've spent a lot of blood and treasure over the last decade, and we need to learn lessons from it, but then try to figure out what comes next. Is this like the 1920s? Is that where we are? Are we and we may have parallels with the 1920s in the interwar period, something like that. And so hopefully we don't lose the lessons we just learned. But it's pretty sobering stuff. I don't know if you notice it. Maybe if you're not a defense reader, you don't notice it. But it's obviously huge, and there's a fair amount of chaos in Washington right now. So, yes, sir. They're making you run the steps.
General Johnson, thank you very much for your service and for your talk. I found the lecture to be very informative and remarkably hopeful. When you were describing what the Air Force does, I was particularly struck by the candidness of your remark that war is war. And if we want to talk about that, that's a separate conversation. I agree, but I think it's an important conversation to have. So my question comes in two parts. First, do we have the citizen awareness right now in our country to have that talk? You mentioned that contact reduces conflict when you were talking about tribalism. Does the same thing apply on a national scale? And does our citizenry have the awareness of other cultures and what's going on to actually have that conversation? And second, is our government responsive enough right now to take an informed citizenry and use it to make decisions about how we engage our military? Thanks again.
Thank you, and thanks for your thoughtful comments. Let me see how to sort through that one. I don't stand in judgment of anybody at DOD. I don't know that we have enough contact, and part of it is on us to communicate better. I'll say that in my first 6 months of being the superintendent, we had several headlines that really got people excited in some ways nationally, and rightfully so. In other ways, because even our own graduates aren't really in touch with where we are every day, that the 98.8% of the cadets are really living up to everything you'd want them to do, and we would. But whose fault is that? Have we told anybody? Have we explained it? But it's not interesting. Good news isn't news, but do we do a good enough job explaining how this kind of works to ourselves or to others? Probably not. Just what's fascinating to me, we do more and more leadership training as we get more senior, older too. And for instance, I'm a Myers-Briggs ENTJ, which is a small fraction of what most people are, and most people are ISTJs, and it's not fun to go and tell people what's going on. I love being around you. It's exciting. And people who are introverts, they know how to learn to do it and be great leaders and everything. But I think almost as an institution, we've been an I. And maybe we need to explain it better and understand ourselves better, maybe be more introspective as well. And especially in this generation, what's changed, I think, is a willingness in our nation to understand and forgive. If you say, we did our best and we blew it, but here's what we're doing to fix it, that seems to be more accepted than to try to pretend like it's perfect and that there aren't flaws, because humans are involved. So I think we can do a better job communicating, and it's hard, it's expensive. And when I got some emails from our alumni a few months ago, and they were being pretty critical of how we're doing, I said, what would help me is several of you are successful in business. Got any pro bono help to help me out? So see if we can do better. So I'm still sorting through the legalities of that, but I think we can do better. Also, just the numbers. It's hard. I'm from Iowa, so I'll pick that out. And it was kind of funny. I was in the Torkham Pass, which is the Khyber Pass between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And one of the times I was there, I ran into this, maybe at Notre Dame you won't like this, but I saw like 15 Afghan young men in black and gold Iowa Hawkeyes T-shirts. I said, wow, Alexander the Great I knew was here, but what's up with that? Well, the Iowa National Guard had been there and given him the shirts, and I went and found them and had lunch with them. And so through our National Guard, I think sometimes people have a sense of what service is like. But if we make it too arcane, that makes it really hard. For the second part of what you asked, again, I can't stand in judgment of our government. I would just say we are at an inflection point, and I wish the national conversation were more engaged. And I know that there are people who care very much about what's going on in Syria. In my last job, I was responsible for all the NATO operations, so everything from Afghanistan to the pirates off the Horn of Africa to counterterrorism in the Med and Kosovo and air policing over the Baltics and everything. And we're very concerned about Syria. Democratic nations kind of had their hands tied, and some other nations in the UN are sort of making plays to not let other nations do what they'd like to do. And so there are a lot of worldwide constraints and internal constraints. But what's a little disappointing, I think, just as a military member, is that the kinds of things that would be helpful to be debated, foreign policy, what's happening internationally, aren't really, because maybe they're considered too hard. I'm not sure. It's like reading The Economist, rather than reading something else when you go home, reading the sports page. So I don't know the answer, but I think we'd all benefit from that, because that's what the democracy is founded on, right? Is informed voters and to ask challenging questions for the nation. And I just would say, being able to look to the nation first rather than to our own political parties or our own tribes, it would be helpful if we could get that. So if you can sort that out, I'd welcome that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
There may be a pen in here, so we would encourage you to write back. Thank you
so much. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.